There we go. There we go. Yep. Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm Nick Webb. I'm a research associate professor at New Mexico State University and physical scientist with the Jornada experimental range in Las Cruces. Today I'm going to talk about a number of projects that all sort of wrap under the banner of looking at how we can improve wind erosion monitoring and assessment across western rangelands, with a particular focus on how we can leverage standardized monitoring data sets like AIM to support wind erosion assessments. The work I'm going to talk about is really a very broad collaborative effort. We have a number of partners involved in the National Wind Erosion Research Network, including BLM, and a number of folks listed on the slide here at the Jornada who are all contributing to various aspects of this work. So I thought I'd start by just going over sort of our high-level project goals before getting into the presentation, just as sort of an overview of where I'm going. We have 5 general goals for this project or set of projects. They are firstly to increase awareness about rangeland wind erosion and dust emissions. Secondly, to identify indicators of wind erosion and air quality that can be incorporated into existing monitoring programs and management frameworks. Thirdly, to develop tools, specifically sort of physically based models that we can use to produce new indicators that leverage available monitoring data sets. Fourthly, to deliver these indicators and interpretations of wind erosion to managers alongside AIM and NRCS's NRI core indicators and within ecological site descriptions. And finally, to identify sort of structural thresholds in ecosystems as well as functional thresholds for wind erosion that can be used to support establishing benchmarks for monitoring and management. And all of this really sort of fits under our broader goal of really wanting to make wind erosion information accessible to agencies so that the processes can be considered alongside other ecosystem services in management decisions. So today I'm going to start with a bit of background on the wind erosion process, and in that I'll introduce the sorts of indicators that we can use to monitor wind erosion. That will sort of lead me into a brief description about the National Wind Erosion Research Network, of which BLM is a partner, and how we're using the network data to develop new tools. And sort of under that banner, I'll talk specifically about an aeolian erosion or AERO model that we're developing at Jornada. This is a sediment transport and dust emission model. And I'll also talk a bit about the landscape data commons that we're developing to really enable us to leverage this model and other erosion prediction models with large monitoring data sets like AIM. I'll then sort of finish up by looking at some applications of AERO, where we're going in terms of linking erosion estimates to ecological site concepts and site descriptions in EDIT, and our thinking of how we can hopefully connect erosion indicators to conservation practices down the line. So as I'm sure you're very aware, much of the BLM land across the western states is in sort of dry landscapes that are naturally susceptible to wind erosion and dust emission. But any land use practices and certain management practices can potentially modify the vegetation and disturb the soils in ways that could accelerate rates of wind erosion and dust emission. And if this happens, there are a number of consequences that we might be interested in. So blowing dust degrades air quality, the particulate matter, fine particulate matter of dust affects respiratory health, can transport fungal spores like the coccidioides that result in valley fever, as well as pathogens, herbicides, pesticides, and so forth. On-site wind erosion removes topsoil, nutrients, and carbon, so this affects soil health and the potential of landscapes to produce vegetation and other ecosystem services. It also influences the resilience of our landscapes to management and climate stresses, as well as the efficacy of sort of climate change mitigation strategies like carbon storage in landscapes as well as adaptation options. And aeolian or wind-driven sediment transport processes are an important feedback driving ecological state transitions and are connected to invasive species. So a very well-known example of that is the transition of our Chihuahuan desert grasslands to mesquite-dominated shrublands. Wind erosion processes are very important in that transition. And blowing dust can pose a hazard to transport on roads and highways. So there's really a broad range of impacts that we're interested in addressing. Unfortunately, there are some challenges to addressing these impacts though. So at the moment, land health standards address air quality through the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, but they really provide little to no guidance for considering wind erosion as an issue for soils and uplands. And part of this problem comes from the fact that ecological site descriptions, where they're available, and reference sheets generally don't contain information about wind erosion that could support establishing benchmarks and interpreting wind erosion rates in landscapes. The tools that we have for assessing air quality impacts of dust, like the GOCART and CMAQ models, which are used by the EPA, really aren't appropriate for assessing wind erosion responses to management. And this is largely because these models sort of prescribe which areas of the landscape the dust comes from. So the models don't respond to changes in vegetation and so forth as they might be influenced by management. And we have a sort of a broader issue here, which is that information and technology transfer from the aeolian research community to range managers has been fairly limited. And this has affected the uptake and use of models to support wind erosion assessments, as well as selection of appropriate indicators that we can use to monitor wind erosion in the field. So the consequence of all this is that there are some fairly basic questions that we still don't really have good answers for about wind erosion in rangelands. And these are things like, well, which landscapes are eroding? How does climate variability and management influence patterns of wind erosion? Which landscapes are most at risk, so that we could prioritize conservation practices in those areas? Which conservation practices will be most effective? And how the different management practices that may be intended for other things like fuels reduction or improving wildlife habitat influence wind erosion rates. So looking forward to some solutions, I'm going to talk a bit about the wind erosion process and use that to explain which indicators are available to us that we could use to start addressing these questions. So the main picture on the slide here sort of illustrates the wind erosion process. Looking at the bottom right of the picture, you can see some wind blowing from right to left across the landscape. When the force of the wind, or we call it the shear stress, is strong enough to overcome the sort of forces holding soil grains to the surface, it can pick them up and start to move them. And when the grains sort of bounce or hop along the surface, we call this process saltation, and it's really responsible for sort of redistributing soil around the landscape. When grains are bouncing along, they can break up or abrade each other, and this process is what releases the fine dust into the atmosphere. And the process also selectively removes soil nutrients and carbon. So the dust in the atmosphere degrades air quality, but it also influences climate through cloud formation and how much solar radiation can get down to the land surface. And vegetation plays a really important role in these processes by directly covering the surface and so protecting it, as well as influencing sort of how much wind energy can reach the surface in different parts of the landscape, and so the spatial patterns and timing of the sediment transport and dust emission. So when we model or measure these processes in the field, we use two common indicators, and these are illustrated in the little diagram on the right of this slide. And these indicators are the horizontal mass flux of sediment, which is a measure of the saltation. So that's the amount of sediment that's blowing along the landscape between two sort of imaginary goalposts. And that has units of something like grams per meter per second. And this is a really good indicator of site stability or site instability. And our other indicator is the vertical sediment mass flux. We also call that the dust emission. And this describes how much fine soil is being lifted up and away from the soil surface. So it has units of grams per meter squared per second because it's coming from an area. And this is a really good indicator of air quality and soil loss. But I guess in addition to these sort of process-based indicators, there are some more familiar ground cover-based indicators that we can use today to monitor the susceptibility of landscapes to wind erosion. And vegetation is really the most important control on wind erosion in landscapes. And this is because it does three things. It directly covers a portion of the soil surface, so it reduces the amount of bare soil at a site. It extracts momentum from the air, so that reduces the wind energy or the force of the wind at the soil surface, and we call this process aerodynamic sheltering. And thirdly, it traps sediment that's being blown around by the wind. So this diagram here attempts to illustrate a couple of the first two of these processes. So if you imagine wind blowing across the landscape, in this case from left to right, the wind on the surface produces a certain amount of shear stress, and that's sort of the force of the wind on the surface. And immediately behind plants, like the green blob on the left, you get a reduction in the shear stress of the wind. So the energy of the wind at the soil surface is much reduced, and then it gradually recovers as you move away from a plant. And what we've found through various studies is that the amount of wind energy or the shear stress of the wind at the soil surface recovers to the total shear stress about 10 times the height, at a distance of about 10 times the height of the vegetation that it has encountered. So sort of thinking about this in terms of the wind erosion process, plants on a landscape will directly protect a portion of the soil surface, making it non-erodible. And then we have an area downwind of plants, sort of indicated by this grey triangle, that is aerodynamically sheltered or protected from the wind by the vegetation reducing the shear stress of the wind. So at some point downwind of vegetation, that shear stress may have recovered sufficiently to start picking up soil particles and moving them. And at that point, we'll get the siltation and dust emission processes. So you can see from these sort of sets of processes here that the height of the vegetation is going to be important, as well as its spatial distribution or the size of gaps between vegetation and the landscape. So these little diagrams here just illustrate the point a bit more, and what's really important is that the fractional ground cover or percent bare ground at a plot really is inadequate on its own as an indicator of wind erosion. So looking on the left, now little boxes here, our grey circles sort of represent plants in the landscape, and the blue triangles represent these sheltered areas. If you have the same cover of vegetation and the same height of vegetation, but change its spatial distribution, you can get dramatically different portions of the surface that are sheltered from the wind, and that can produce dramatically different wind erosion rates. Similarly, if you have the same cover of vegetation and the same spatial distribution, but change the vegetation height, you would also get dramatic differences in the portion of the landscape that's sheltered from the wind. So really, the vegetation canopy gap size distribution and height are critical for assessing wind erosion. And what may not be widely known is that the canopy gap intercept method and vegetation height method were included in the monitoring manual in part because they're very good indicators of wind erosion. So we have a number of standardized monitoring programs out there like AIM that are already collecting this information across landscapes. So the core methods used by AIM collect a lot of information that tells us about the susceptibility of landscapes to wind erosion. We also have a number of really well-established air quality monitoring programs from the county level to sort of the global level that measure particulate matter concentrations in the atmosphere, so how much dust is in the air, and these are supported by satellite observations. But at the moment, we don't really have anything that connects air quality and the sort of, well, the dust impacts on air quality with management of uplands. But there's a real opportunity here to develop models that can leverage the core indicators collected by monitoring programs like AIM to address how management and different land use practices are influencing the susceptibility of landscapes to wind erosion, and then connect that with air quality downwind. And that's really what we're aiming to do. So this slide sort of summarizes our approach for leveraging indicators from programs like AIM to support wind erosion assessments. And our approach has been to establish a small number of intensively monitored research sites to provide data to develop and calibrate a model that can leverage these monitoring data sets. And those research sites are the National Wind Erosion Research Network that we established in 2014. So we use the data from the network to develop this model, and the model we've called the Aeolian Erosion Model, or AERO model. We've calibrated the model using data from the Wind Erosion Network, and we're now applying it to standardized monitoring data sets like AIM, NRI, National Park Services, inventory and monitoring data, as well as other data sets collected by ARS, USGS, and so forth. And the core methods of line point intercept, vegetation height, and gap intercept are really central to us being able to do this work. So a little bit of background on the Wind Erosion Network. As I mentioned, we established the network in 2014 as a multi-partner effort. It's really sort of grounded in the USDA's long-term agro-ecosystem research network, or LTAR network. BLM has been a core partner from the beginning in this, as well as Department of Defense, USGS, Nature Conservancy, and most recently Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And NRCS have been a key partner in supporting the model development side of things. So the slide here shows the location of our network sites. The blue markers are sites that are established, and we have 15 of those. We hope to get the orange sites online again when we can get back out to the field. These are located in areas that are rangeland and croplands across different soils, vegetation types and crop types, and under different management systems. And the photos here just illustrate or show a couple of the sites on BLM land in the San Luis Valley and near Canyonlands or Moab, Utah. So each of the network sites follows a standard methods protocol for the instrumentation and how we collect data. And the site layout's illustrated on the right of this slide here. So each of the sites covers a hectare. We have a central meteorological tower, which is indicated by the T, and there's a photo of one of those in the bottom left. These towers measure wind speed profiles, temperature profiles, and that kind of thing that enable us to characterize the wind flowing over the surface. Then we use a stratified random sample design to measure the sediment mass flux, or the horizontal flux of sediment across the landscape. And the colored shapes on the diagram illustrate where those might be. So we have 27 sediment sampler masts. These are called modified Wilson and Cook, or MWAC samplers. We also measure dust deposition, and at some of the sites, we measure fine dust concentrations and dust emission. We also run vegetation transects at the site. So we have 3 100-meter transects, which are indicated by the gray dotted lines. We measure these 4 times a year, and we use a slightly modified version of the core method. So we've just added some additional soil surface codes and to really get a good handle on surface properties that can help us with our model development. And we're using these methods, or the core methods, at the network site specifically so that the research that we do and the models we develop can be directly applicable to larger monitoring data sets like AIM. So this slide illustrates sort of graphically the process that we're going through. On the left, we have our different standardized monitoring data sets. The National Wind Erosion Research Network shown at the top represents a very small portion of these. And we're using those data to feed into the AERO model development. We can then apply AERO to the larger monitoring data sets. So collectively, we have around or a bit over 70,000 monitoring plots. And we're doing this on the USDA SciNet high-performance computer. So for each plot, we produce estimates of the horizontal sediment flux as our indicator of site stability, and particulate matter emissions in different size bins that correspond to what we might be interested with under the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. The way that we've calibrated the aero model allows us to produce sort of a probability distribution of these estimates of sediment fluxes for each monitoring plot, and that allows us to put confidence intervals on our plot level estimates and really transparently convey what the uncertainty is associated with the model estimates for each plot. So from there, our approach is to essentially analyze the model estimates alongside our other core indicators of ecosystem structure and function from the monitoring data sets at different scales, and feed that into both research projects and development of sort of stakeholder tools to deliver this information. So this is a sort of a graphical representation of how the model works. We pull data from an individual monitoring plot, so it could be an AIM plot. Based on a plot location, we query additional information about soil properties like particle size distribution of the soil, as well as wind speed probability distribution for the given plot location. And from there, the aero model produces estimates of these indicators of horizontal sediment flux and dust emission. So I don't want to overwhelm you with equations, but I do want to make a couple of points about this slide, which is that this slide illustrates really the entirety of sort of the guts of the aero model. And the important point here is that in terms of erosion prediction models, this is a very small model with a very small number of parameters. And this means that we can really get a good understanding of where the uncertainties are in the model and how we can address them or take them into account as we report the model estimates. So just talking you through this a bit, on the left-hand side of the slide, we have a couple of equations that represent the soil erodibility or its susceptibility, or the susceptibility of soil to be picked up by the wind, and we can apply corrections for soil moisture. At the top of the slide, I have a box labeled drag partitioning, and the equation in that box essentially describes how the wind speed recovers behind vegetation. So that equation describes that red line there. And this information goes into the large red box, which calculates our indicator of the horizontal sediment flux, and then that goes into the blue box, which calculates our dust emission. So that's essentially how the whole model works. So in order to apply aero to monitoring data sets, we're developing what we're calling the Landscape Data Commons, which is a project that Sarah McCord and I are leading. This slide here illustrates the concept of the data commons. Starting in the top left, we have a number of standardized monitoring data sets like AIM, NRI, and those collected by the National Wind Erosion Research Network, all following the same core methods. The data commons has a set of R and Python scripts that essentially bring these data sets together into a central repository, including the sensor data from the National Wind Erosion Research Network. It allows us to connect these monitoring data sets with external databases, for example, on soils and plants, link these back to the plot level data. We can calculate standardized indicators across the different monitoring data sets and feed them into models like aero, and we can then link the estimates from the models back to the plot level indicators and feed those out to users through community tools like the Land Potential Knowledge System and hopefully through ecological site descriptions in the Ecosystem Dynamics Interpretive Tool edit. So to enable us to do all this, Sarah has written an R package called Pterodactyl that does all the data wrangling. And Pterodactyl essentially enables us to work with data collected following the core methods that AIM uses, as well as other data sets collected by National Wind Erosion Research Network So it allows us to gather these different data sets together into organized tables, join various grouping variables that can support analyses, and from there calculate standardized indicators to support analyses and to support model applications. So this slide really describes sort of the functionality within Pterodactyl for calculating different indicators. And Sarah has organized this by method, which you can see down the left-hand side of the slide. And there's a lot of flexibility in the functions in Pterodactyl to enable us to sort of customize our calculations for different purposes. So you can see different sort of sets of functions here, and those that we use to produce the inputs to Aero are highlighted in yellow. So we need the average maximum height of the vegetation at the plot, we need the full canopy gap size distribution, and we need the percent cover of bare soil at the start. If we were running a different model, like a water erosion model, we might use a different set of functions to produce the standardized indicators for that model. So when we apply Aero to monitoring data sets, we can get plot level estimates of sediment fluxes for different sort of particle size bins. So the maps on the left here illustrate some examples of an Aero application to, I think, about 30,000 AIM and NRI plots. So the top map shows the horizontal sediment flux, so that's our indicator of site stability. And the bottom two maps show PM10 and PM2.5 emissions. So this is fine dust emission, which are indicators of air quality and soil and nutrient losses. So we can drill down into particular areas of interest, like New Mexico, and the larger maps here show Aero estimates for about 1,100 AIM plots for the same set of indicators. And we can start to interpret these in the context of other indicators of ecosystem structure and function and ecosystem services that we can derive from the monitoring data sets. It's quite difficult to interpret the model indicators or the model estimates because we really don't have a whole lot of context for knowing what's a large sediment flux, what's a small sediment flux, and what the ecological implications or air quality implications of those fluxes might be. So the approach that we're taking to interpret the model outputs is to do so in the context of the ecological land resource hierarchy. And at this point in time, we're really trying to focus on understanding what are distributions of potential sediment transport rates for different ecological sites in different major land resource areas. So the graphs on the right here show sort of probability distributions of sediment fluxes predicted for plots in different ecological sites in MLRA 42 in New Mexico here. So what we're looking to do with this is essentially drill down where we can to the ecological site and the state level to understand how changes in vegetation state within landscapes might influence wind erosion rates. And from there, use that to help us define benchmarks to support our monitoring and management efforts. So Rachel Burke has been doing a lot of work to develop quantitative keys to key the monitoring plots to ecological sites and ecological site groups and the states within those. So these graphs show three indicators: bare soil, percent of plot with canopy gaps greater than 1 metre, and mean vegetation height for the gravelly and sandy ecological site groups in southern MLRA 42. So what you can see is that this kind of plot enables us to visualize what are the distributions of these indicators for the different sites and states, and start to examine how do state changes influence the structure of vegetation in landscapes. So by applying the model to these indicators, we can also produce estimates of sediment fluxes and look at what potential wind erosion responses will be to state changes within a landscape. And we can start to pull out some interesting things. So looking at the sandy ecological site group here, you can see that the transition from our sort of reference black grama grassland to our mesquite shrubland results in an increase in vegetation height overall. So you would think that taller the vegetation, the more sheltering it will produce. But this is really compensated for by a large increase in bare ground and large increase in canopy gaps greater than 1 metre. So that effectively reduces the sheltering of the vegetation, resulting in significantly larger wind erosion rates. And we get different response in the gravelly ecological sites where the gravel and sort of rock fragment cover at the sites really protect the surface from wind, despite changes in vegetation height and the canopy gap size distribution. So by looking at reference states within these sites, we can start to identify where there might be critical thresholds for state changes for different indicators that we can use as benchmarks to support monitoring assessments, and use these to help us manage wind erosion as well as interpret our model wind erosion rates or wind erosion responses. By applying aero to the monitoring data, we can also look at functional thresholds for wind erosion. So the plots here show our horizontal sediment flux plotted against gaps greater than 1 metre, and we can look and see, is there a certain percentage of the plot with a certain amount of canopy gaps of which wind erosion really takes off in a particular ecological site, and we can assess whether or not that might be generalizable to other parts of the landscape. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, and that's because of the sort of complex interaction between vegetation height and its spatial distribution. So sort of scaling back out, by leveraging these different monitoring data sets together, we can also establish regional context for our evaluations and more regional benchmarks, particularly in circumstances where we don't have ecological site information to develop those more specific benchmarks. Sort of bringing this back to the landscape data commons, what we really want to do from here is improve the accessibility of these wind erosion estimates from aero to the management community. So this slide is sort of a simplification of that earlier slide I showed about the landscape data commons. What we're really looking at doing is linking our monitoring data with erosion prediction models, including aero and water erosion models like REM, which is the rangeland hydrology and erosion models. Link the erosion estimates back to core indicators in the data commons, and then serve those out through, for example, ecological site descriptions in EDIT, allowing users to perhaps interact with the models, run scenarios, that kind of thing, identify where they may have resource concerns, and identify appropriate conservation practices. A link we haven't made yet, but looking at or exploring how we can make the link at the moment, is how we can serve these information through mobile apps like EDIT and the Land PKS app, so that users in the field can readily access ecological site information, summaries of indicator distributions for particular sites, as well as model estimates of erosion, in addition to collecting their own data to feed into the system. So at the moment, we have a project that's just been funded by NRCS to essentially do just this. This slide sort of summarizes the workflow that we're aiming for. So on the left-hand side, we have the landscape data commons containing all our data, the AIM data, NRI, and so forth. We can run our erosion models off those indicators, and then through quantitative ecological site keys, produce ecological site descriptions that contain dynamic summaries of our various indicators calculated from the monitoring data sets. So we're going to trial this in the ecological site summary tool that Rachel Burke presented a couple of weeks ago, with a view to moving it into EDIT where we can in the future. So what we'd like to be able to do is enable users to bring up an ecological site description, have graphs of different indicators within those that could perhaps be visualized to identify thresholds of concern to support establishing benchmarks, as well as producing dynamic state and transition models with some sort of traffic light system that shows where you may have erosion concerns or other resource concerns and how they can be linked to conservation practices. So at this point in time, we're working to get the calibration of the aero model published. Hopefully we'll have that submitted before too long. I've been saying that for the last 8 years, I think, but we're getting very close. Where we have now implemented Aero to the sort of complete AIM and LMF data set, and we're about to embark on its application to NRI. So we should have that about 60,000 plots run through Aero within the next week or so. We're now looking at how we can serve these model estimates alongside other core indicators through the landscape data commons, focusing on indicators that relate to soil and site stability and air quality. And from there, looking at how we can incorporate the estimates into the ecological site summary tool with a view to eventually getting them into ecological site descriptions in EDIT alongside other core indicators of ecosystem services. And sort of parallel to this sort of more applied effort, we have a number of projects looking at applications of Aero to understand more about wind erosion in western rangelands. These include projects looking at impacts of oil and gas development, cheap grass invasion and altered fire cycles, as well as grass shrub transitions in landscapes. We're hoping to get a project going looking at potential impacts of pinyon juniper fuels reduction treatments on air quality using Aero and monitoring data. And through the LTAR network, we're getting a fairly large project going looking at sort of interactions between invasive species across both public and private or non-federal rangelands in the west and soil erosion. So I'll finish up there. I've just listed a few publications on here that you can access if you're interested in more information about what I've talked about. Just on the weekend, we submitted the top paper to Rangeland Ecology and Management, which describes the importance of vegetation canopy gap size and height for monitoring wind erosion. The second paper there looks at indicators and benchmarks for wind erosion monitoring and assessment. The second part of that paper really addresses approaches for establishing benchmarks that are relevant to a broad range of indicators, not just wind erosion. And the other papers talk about the wind erosion network and our vision for this work. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thanks a ton, Nick. That was awesome. Really cool research and great to hear you talk about it. And yeah, really excited to see kind of the next steps and how this moves forward. This is just a reminder to attendees that you can type your questions for Nick up in the Q&A section. Should be at the top right of your team screen. And Elisa and Lauren and I will publish those and get those answered. So feel free to type those in there now, and we'll get them answered while we have Nick online here. And if you do have any other follow-up questions for Nick or others, feel free to reach out over email. But Nick, we do have a couple questions up front for you. So the first one here is would it be possible for field officers to get erosion estimates for AIM plots, and how would you recommend we use that information? So I imagine this is like if there's like a subset or a subset of AIM plots or a specific area folks are interested in, is it possible to get kind of run the area model on those that kind of subset of that or that area, and then how would folks go about using that?
Yes, definitely. So we have Aero run on all of the AIM and LMF plots as of yesterday or this morning. So they are all ready. What we need to do is get them into a single database that we can then make accessible to people. And our goal is, or what we're working towards, is making the indicators available through the landscape data commons. But you can definitely reach out to me as well, because if someone in a particular field office is interested in using them, we can get them to you directly. So don't hesitate to contact me about that.
Awesome, thanks, Nick. The next question is actually from Alita. So two questions. The first one is, have you been able to do much evaluation of the model outside of New Mexico? Do you want to start with that one? And we can go on to the next one.
Yeah, sure. So the answer is yes. So far we have calibrated the model using data from the rangeland wind erosion network sites. And so the sites that we've calibrated it on range from very dense grasslands through sparse grasslands, shrub invaded grasslands to shrub dominated systems. So we've, while we haven't calibrated the model for every landscape, we have calibrated it across a range of soil properties and vegetation structures. Just a little information on that, the approach that we've taken to calibrating the model essentially accounts for the uncertainties in the different parameter values. It's called a GLUE approach, or generalized likelihood uncertainty estimation. We borrowed this approach from the hydrologic modeling community. And what it essentially enables us to do is to evaluate what the uncertainties are in the model parameters across a range of systems that we want to apply them to. So when we deliver estimates from the aero model, we wouldn't be just giving you sort of a single value, but we'd give you a range of values with confidence intervals and that kind of thing. So far, we've found that the distribution of indicator estimates from the model overlap very well with our field measurements from the wind erosion network site. So we're pretty confident in how well it's performing for both sort of small sediment transport rates as well as the larger events.
Great, thanks. And just the second part to Alita's question was, do you think this could be used to predict changes following fire as vegetation recovers to help determine whether our actions are helping reduce wind erosion? So kind of, yeah, looking at fire and recovery.
I very much hope so. We have an NSF funded project at the moment specifically looking at post-fire wind erosion, in which we're using AIM data with the aero model to evaluate wind erosion rates post-fire and how different sort of post-fire treatments might influence erosion rates as well. So we really developed aero with the view to it being applied to these sorts of management contexts or applications.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, it's great to hear a lot of collaboration going on and a lot of cool directions the research is going in. So yeah, thanks, Nick. Just a final call for any questions for Nick. No more lined up right now. So I'll hand it over to Alita to talk about the recordings and the SharePoint.
Thanks, Alex. That was a great presentation. I see a lot of utility in so many different programs for this kind of information. For everyone out there, if you want to rewatch this presentation or share it with your colleagues in the Department of the Interior, you can find it on the BLM AIM SharePoint. And we have one more presentation coming up in this series, and that will be next week when we will be presenting Developing State, District, and Field Office Scale LODIC Reporting Templates with Scott Miller of the National AIM team and Justin Jimenez from BLM Utah. And you can find those presentations either on the SharePoint or at our external website, aim.landscapetoolbox.org. Are there any follow-up questions, Alex?
I don't see any more questions. I don't think so. Nope.
Well, thank you everybody who joined us today, and we hope to see you next week.